The first thing Priya Nair ever spilled on Nikolai Dragan was not coffee. It was a full bowl of clam chowder, cream-based with oyster crackers, directly onto the sleeve of what she would later learn was a $12,000 suit. She didn't know that yet. She just knew the man sitting at table 4 had gone very, very still, in the way that certain animals go still right before they do something you don't want them to do. And Priya, 26 years old, 260 pounds of nervous energy and bad luck, stood there holding an empty bowl and thought, I am going to get fired on my 3rd day. The restaurant was called Palazzo, which was the kind of name that told you everything you needed to know. White tablecloths, dim lighting, a wine list that was longer than most novels. Priya had gotten the waitressing job through her cousin's boyfriend, who knew the floor manager, who had agreed to take a chance on her, despite the fact that her only relevant experience was 3 years at a Denny's in Trenton, New Jersey. She had been trying very hard. She had been doing well, actually, right up until table 4. The man at table 4 did not yell. He did not stand up. He looked at his sleeve, then looked at Priya, and the 2 men sitting across from him, large men, both of them, in suits that fit badly in a very specific way that suggested they were hiding something underneath, went rigid like they'd been switched off. I'm so sorry, Priya said, which was the most inadequate sentence in the English language. The tray, there was a wet spot on the floor, and I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get. She reached for a napkin, and somehow, in the process of reaching, managed to knock over his water glass too. The water spread across the white tablecloth like a slow disaster. One of the large men made a sound that was not quite human. The man at table 4, dark hair going silver at the temples, jaw like something carved, eyes that were a very particular shade of grey that Priya would later describe to her roommate as the colour of bad weather, picked up his water glass, which now contained nothing, and set it back down with a small, precise click. Bring me another, he said, and take this off the table. He gestured at the wet tablecloth. His voice was low and even, and gave away absolutely nothing. Priya nodded so fast her ponytail whipped her own face. Yes, sir, absolutely. Right away. She backed away from the table, turned, walked directly into the dessert cart, and sent 3 crème brûlées sliding off the edge. 2 of them landed on the floor. One landed on the shoe of the floor manager, who had come over to see what was happening. The floor manager's name was Dennis. Dennis looked at his shoe. Dennis looked at Priya. Dennis looked at the man at table 4, who was watching all of this with an expression that Dennis could not read, and that frightened him considerably. Nair, Dennis said quietly, please go take your break. She did not get fired that night. She didn't understand why. Dennis told her, the next morning when she came in for her shift, that the gentleman at table 4 had specifically requested she be kept on staff. Dennis looked like he wanted to say more about this, like there were several things he wanted to say, but instead he just straightened his tie and told her to be more careful. Who is he? Priya asked. Dennis looked at her for a long moment. A regular, he said, and walked away. She asked Gina, who had worked the floor at Palazzo for 6 years and knew everything about everyone. Gina was wiping down the bar when Priya asked, and she stopped wiping and looked at Priya with an expression that was somewhere between amused and genuinely concerned. That's Nikolai Dragan, Gina said. Okay, Priya said. And? Gina looked at her for another moment. You really just moved here, huh? From Trenton? Right. Gina went back to wiping the bar. He owns things. Buildings, mostly. Some other businesses. He's a regular. That's all you need to know. Just don't spill anything else on him. Priya intended very sincerely to follow that advice. She spilled wine on him the following Thursday. It was a 2011 Barolo, and it went directly onto his shirt, which was white, because, of course, it was white, because the universe had apparently decided that Priya Nair was some kind of cosmic punishment aimed specifically at Nikolai Dragan's wardrobe. She stood there with the empty glass and waited for something terrible to happen. He looked at the stain spreading across his chest. He looked at her. He looked back at the stain. "I don't suppose," he said very quietly, "that this is intentional." "No," Priya said, "sir. Absolutely not. I'm so sorry, I don't know why I keep." "Dragan," said one of the large men, whose name she had learned was Oleg, and who seemed to experience genuine physical pain every time Priya came within 10 feet of the table. "It's fine," Nikolai Dragan said, and reached for his jacket, which was draped over the back of his chair, and put it on over the stain. "Bring us the check." He left a tip that was larger than Priya's weekly paycheck. She stood at the service station and stared at it for a long time. It became a thing. She didn't mean for it to become a thing. He came in twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, always the same table, always with different combinations of the same rotating cast of large, serious men. And Priya, despite her very best efforts, managed to cause some minor catastrophe within his general vicinity approximately 60% of the time. The bread basket, a soup spoon, a candle once, though that one technically wasn't her fault. She'd been walking perfectly normally, and the candles had simply chosen that moment to tip, and she'd caught it before it could set anything on fire, which she felt deserved some credit. He never got angry. He never raised his voice. He just watched her with those grey eyes and waited for the chaos to resolve itself, and then went back to whatever quiet, serious conversation she had interrupted. The men with him were not so composed. Oleg had developed what appeared to be a stress response that triggered whenever Priya entered his peripheral vision. Another one, a younger guy with a scar on his chin, who Priya privately called Scarface, because she never caught his actual name, had taken to physically moving things away from the edge of the table whenever she approached. Glasses, candles, anything that could become a projectile. The thing was, and Priya could not explain this, she was not clumsy at any other table. She'd been waitressing for 3 years. She knew how to carry a tray. She knew how to pour without spilling. She just, around table 4, something short-circuited. She'd analyzed it. She'd tried to identify the cause. The closest she'd gotten was a theory involving the combination of the slightly uneven floor near table 4, the specific acoustics of that corner of the restaurant that made it hard to hear properly, and the fact that Nikolai Dragan had the kind of face that made it difficult to remember what you were supposed to be doing. She did not share this theory with anyone. One Tuesday in March, he arrived later than usual and sat down, and Priya, who had been watching the door for the past 45 minutes and refused to examine why, took a breath and walked over. "Good evening," she said. "Can I start you with something to drink?" He looked up. For a moment he just looked at her with that unreadable expression, and then he said, "Do you know how many suits you've ruined?" Priya's face went hot. "3, I think. Maybe 4, if you count the Thursday with the 4, he confirmed. "I'm really sorry about that." Sit down," he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "Sit down," he said again. "I have a question." Priya looked around. Dennis was nowhere in sight. Oleg was staring at her with an expression of profound alarm. She sat down in the empty chair across from Nikolai Dragan, which was something she was absolutely not supposed to do, and which she did anyway because something in his voice made it very hard to do anything else. "What did you do before this?" he asked. "Denny's," she said. "In Trenton. And before that I was in school. I was studying hospitality management, but I had to stop because of money, and my mum got sick and I needed to." She stopped. "Sorry, that's more than you asked for." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were folded on the table, and she noticed for the first time that his knuckles were scarred in a way that didn't match the $12,000 suits. "You're good with people," he said. "At the tables that aren't mine. I'm good at my job," she said a little defensively. "I just have a specific problem with this table. With this table," she confirmed. Something happened at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to its cousin that Priya felt her train of thought derail completely. I have a position available, he said, in my office. Administrative work. I go through assistants quickly. How quickly? Priya asked, because she had apparently lost any filter she possessed. The last one lasted 9 days. What happened to her? She found the work environment stressful. Priya looked at Oleg, who was standing 6 feet away and vibrating with barely contained agitation. She looked back at Nikolai Dragan. What's the pay? She said. She told her roommate Abina that night. Abina was a nursing student who had heard most of Priya's life disasters with the patient expression of someone who had given up being surprised. So let me understand, Abina said. The man whose clothes you keep ruining offered you a job, an administrative position with a crime lord. We don't know that for sure, Priya said. Abina looked at her. Priya, Gina, said he owns things. Priya, the pay is 3 times what I make at Palazzo, Priya said. Abina was quiet for a moment. Are you going to take it? Priya thought about the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter with her mother's name on them. She thought about her student loans, deferred but not gone. She thought about the grey eyes and the not-quite smile, and the way he'd said you're good with people like it was a simple observation of fact, without condescension, without surprise. Yeah, she said. I think I am. The office building was in Midtown, 43rd floor, and had the kind of lobby that made Priya acutely aware of every thread count in her outlet mall blazer. The receptionist, a woman named Constance, who had the bearing of a retired general, looked Priya up and down when she walked in and said, with careful neutrality, "You must be the new assistant." Priya Nair, Priya confirmed. Constance said, which was not encouraging. She was walked through the office by a man named Felix, who was young and efficient, and had the air of someone who had learned to give safety briefings without making them sound like safety briefings. Mr. Dragan's schedule is managed through this system here, Felix said. You'll handle incoming correspondence, coordinate with external partners, and manage his calendar. There are certain meetings that you will schedule and not ask about. There are certain names that you'll write down and not Google. Okay, Priya said. Felix looked at her. You understand what I mean? I do, Priya said, and she did. She'd grown up in a neighborhood in Trenton where you learned very young which questions were fine to ask and which ones you kept to yourself. The specific nature of the business might be different here, but the principle was the same. Good, Felix said, and seemed to relax slightly. Any questions? What's the dress code? Felix blinked, apparently having expected a different kind of question. Business professional. Conservative, great, Priya said, and silently calculated whether she could get 3 new blazers dry cleaned in time for Friday. She broke the printer on her second day. Not intentionally. She was trying to clear a paper jam and something inside the machine made a sound like a small explosion, and then the display panel went dark and stayed dark. She stood in front of it for a full 30 seconds, then went and found Felix. I broke the printer, she said. Felix closed his eyes briefly. Which one? The big one. In the main office. That's a $12,000 piece of. Felix stopped. Okay, I'll call the technician. I'm really sorry. I don't know what. It's fine, said a voice from the doorway, and Priya turned and found Nikolai Dragan standing there in his coat, which meant he had just arrived, which meant he had walked in, and the first thing he'd encountered was this. He walked past her to his desk, set down his briefcase, and sat down. He looked at the dark printer. He looked at Priya. Do you have the Ellison correspondence? He asked. Yes, Priya said, slightly dazed, and went to her desk and got it. He read through it without saying anything else about the printer. Priya sat at her desk in the outer office and tried to make herself very small, which was not a thing she was physically capable of, but which she attempted anyway. Oleg came in around noon and stopped dead when he saw her sitting there. No, he said. Hello, Priya said. Oleg pointed at her. He pointed at Nikolai's office. He pointed back at her. He seemed to be having difficulty forming words. She's effective, Nikolai said from inside the office, without looking up from whatever he was reading, when she's not near a printer. Oleg said something in what Priya assumed was Ukrainian, turned around and left. I'm going to take that as a compliment, Priya said to the empty doorway. You should, Nikolai said. She was good at the job. She knew she was good at the job because the work was not actually that different from 3 years of managing 12 tables at once during a Saturday night rush, which required tracking a dozen moving parts simultaneously, anticipating problems before they happened, and maintaining cheerful competence while everything around you was on fire. She could do all of those things. She just couldn't always do them without breaking something in the immediate vicinity. The coffee machine in the break room lasted 4 days before she put it out of commission. A desk lamp went inexplicably dark on day 7. On day 11, she walked into a glass door that she had been walking through twice a day for a week and a half, somehow missed it at a critical angle, and hit it face first with a sound that brought 3 men running. Nikolai Dragan appeared in the doorway of his office. He looked at her standing in the hallway with her hand over her nose, eyes watering, and said, "Are you injured?" "No," Priya said with dignity. "Your nose is bleeding." "It's fine," she said. "I'll just." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the bathroom and went and sat on the edge of the sink and held a paper towel to her face and thought seriously about whether she was somehow cursed. When she came back out, there was a first aid kit on her desk that hadn't been there before. She didn't ask how it had gotten there. The previous record for an assistant, she had learned from Constance, was 9 days. Priya had made it to 13 before the glass door incident, and 12 more after it. She knew she was past the record because Felix had mentioned it, in a tone of voice that suggested he was genuinely surprised and wasn't sure how he felt about it. What helped, she thought, was that she was not afraid of Nikolai Dragan. She didn't know entirely why. She understood, in a factual sense, what kind of man he was. She'd been working in his office for 3 weeks, and she wasn't oblivious. She understood what certain meetings meant, and what certain names in his correspondence indicated, and what the large men who rotated through the office were there for. She understood all of that. But when she sat across from him, or stood in his doorway asking about his schedule, or brought him coffee, which she had learned to carry with both hands, lid firmly on, tray pressed against her body, she felt something that was essentially the opposite of fear. She felt, for reasons she could not fully explain, like she was in the right place. "You're the first one who makes eye contact," he told her once, when she was standing at his desk going through his schedule for the following week. "Is that unusual?" she asked. "In this office?" "Yes." She thought about it. "Are you trying to say I should stop?" "No," he said. He was looking at the schedule, not at her. "I'm saying the opposite of that." The trouble started in her 5th week. A man named Hargrove, blonde, expensively dressed, the particular kind of handsome that generally indicated someone who had coasted on it, began showing up at the office. He was, Felix told her quietly, a business associate. He was, Constance told her, in a tone that communicated everything Constance's careful neutrality usually concealed, a problem that Mr. Dragan is managing. Hargrove looked at Priya the first time he saw her with an expression that went from dismissive to calculating in under 2 seconds. He asked her to get him coffee, which was technically in her job description, and which she did. He asked her to stay late to help with some paperwork, which was not in her job description, and which she declined. He called her sweetheart once, and she turned from her desk and looked at him with an expression that had been honed through 3 years of handling difficult customers at Denny's at 2 a.m. and said with perfect pleasantness, "It's Priya. Can I help you with something?" He smiled. It was not a nice smile. "Feisty," he said, and walked into Nikolai's office without knocking. She sat at her desk and breathed carefully for a moment. She noticed over the following week that Nikolai watched Hargrove differently than he watched other people. There was a stillness to it, The same stillness she'd first seen at table 4 in Palazzo, the animal stillness of something deciding, and she had enough sense to understand that whatever situation was being managed, it was not going well. On a Wednesday afternoon, she was in the file room when she overheard them. She wasn't eavesdropping, she was filing, which she had been doing for 20 minutes, and they had apparently not noticed she was in there. "Think I'm stupid," Hargrove was saying. "I know about the Makova accounts. I know about everything." A pause. "Then you know," Nikolai said, in that level, uninflected voice, "that you're having this conversation with the wrong person. I think I'm having it with exactly the right person. I think you're going to give me what I'm asking for, or I'm going to." Priya, who had been standing very still, reached up to get a folder from the top shelf and stepped back and put her heel directly into a metal filing box on the floor, which toppled over and sent a cascade of folders sliding across the tile with a tremendous amount of noise. The conversation in the hallway stopped. Priya stood in the wreckage of the filing system and thought, "I am going to get murdered in a file room in Midtown Manhattan." Nikolai appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the files. He looked back at her. "How long have you been in here?" he asked. 20 minutes, she said. "I was filing." He looked at her for another moment. "Come out when you're done," he said, and pulled the door most of the way closed. She heard Hargrove say something she couldn't make out, and Nikolai's voice, quieter now, and then footsteps. She stood in the file room for a moment, then picked up the fallen box and started putting the folders back, and thought very hard about not thinking about what she'd heard. Hargrove found her in the parking garage the following Tuesday evening. She'd worked late. She'd been doing that more often, mostly because the work was interesting, and partly because the office had better heating than her apartment, and the garage was mostly empty when she walked out. She had her keys in her hand and was thinking about dinner when Hargrove stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. "Miss Nair," he said. She stopped. She assessed. He was alone as far as she could tell, and he was blocking the most direct path to her car. And the thing about growing up in the part of Trenton she'd grown up in was that you learned to read situations like this very quickly. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, keeping her voice even, "the office is closed. If you need to schedule something with Mr. Dragan—" "I don't need to schedule anything," he said, walking toward her. "I need you to give him a message." "You can email." "I need you," he said, "to tell him that I'm not the only one who knows, that there are copies, that if anything happens to me, everything goes to every federal." "Okay," Priya said. He blinked. He'd clearly expected more resistance. "Okay." "I'll pass that along," she said in the same tone she used when a customer at Denny's told her their eggs were wrong. Clear, unbothered, already moving to the next thing. "Is there anything else?" He stared at her. "You're not." He seemed genuinely thrown. "You're not scared?" "I'm trying to get to my car," Priya said. "You're in the way." Something shifted in his expression then, the calculation coming back, colder than before. He stepped closer. He was taller than her by several inches, though she had quite a bit on him in terms of horizontal distribution, which was a thing she had learned to be aware of. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "You have no idea what you're in the middle of." "I'm an administrative assistant," Priya said. "I manage a calendar. I'm in the middle of going home." She shifted her weight and made eye contact that she intended to be extremely clear. "Please move." He moved. Not because he wanted to, she could see that, but because she had taken a half step forward that made her intent entirely legible. And she was not small, and her expression was the one that had once convinced a table of 6 drunk men at a Denny's at midnight to pay their check and leave without incident. She walked to her car. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she got there, which she noted as a data point and then set aside, because shaking was fine as long as it happened after. She sat in her car for a moment. Then she took out her phone and called the number she'd been given for emergencies, which she had hoped very sincerely she would never have to use. Felix answered on the second ring. "Hargrove is in the parking garage on 43rd, she said. "He just had a conversation with me that I think Mr. Dragan needs to know about." She paused. "I also think you should probably come get him before he does something that makes your week more complicated." She did not see Nikolai until the following morning. He was in his office when she arrived, which was unusual. He generally came in after she did, and Oleg was there, which was also unusual for this early, and both of them looked up when she walked in. "Sit down," Nikolai said, and she did, in the chair across from his desk, and he looked at her for a moment. "You called Felix," he said. "Yes, rather than calling me." Felix's number was labeled emergency. Yours was labeled schedule. She paused. "I can update my contacts if that was wrong." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Oleg made a sound that might, under significant compression, have been a laugh. "What he said to you," Nikolai said. "In the garage, he wants you to know there are copies," Priya said, "and that other people have them, and that if something happens to him, it goes to federal." "I understand what it means," he said. "I'm asking how you are." She blinked. "He put you in a situation that—" He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. "You shouldn't have been in that position." "I wasn't in any real danger," Priya said, which was true as far as she could assess it. He wanted to deliver a message. He needed someone to deliver it to. "I was available." Nikolai was quiet for a moment. "You weren't frightened." "I've been frightened more by the branch crowd on a Sunday," she said, and then caught herself. "Sorry, I'm not trying to be." "No," he said. "Don't apologize for that." He looked at her, and the grey eyes were doing something she couldn't read. The shift in question caught her off guard. "For the money," she said. "There are other jobs." She thought about lying and decided not to. "I'm good at it," she said. "I know what it looks like from the outside. I break things and I—" She gestured vaguely at herself and at the general history of disasters. "But I'm actually good at the work, and the work is interesting." "And you?" She stopped. "Go ahead," he said. "You treated me like a person," she said carefully. "At the restaurant. You'd have been within your rights to be awful about it, and you weren't. And you kept me on, and you offered me this, and you never once. You don't talk to me like I'm—" She stopped again. "I was in a Denny's in Trenton for 3 years, and I was invisible. This is the first place I've worked where I've felt like what I do actually matters." The office was very quiet. "It does," Nikolai said. "Matter." She nodded. She was not going to make this weird. She was going to be professional. She was going to— "Priya," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice. He had never used her first name before. Did something to her internal infrastructure. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay," she said. "This situation with Hargrove is going to be resolved," he said. "But the resolution involves certain activities that fall outside what most people would consider a normal work environment. I need an assistant who understands that and is still willing to be here." "I'm still willing to be here," she said immediately. "I haven't told you what's involved." "I know," she said. "I'm still telling you." He looked at her. She had the feeling, suddenly, that she was being measured against something, not weighed and found wanting, but genuinely evaluated, in a way that very few people ever actually did. Most people looked at Priya and saw certain things: her size, her background, the outlet mall blazer, the Trenton accent, and made assessments from there. This was different. "All right," he said finally. "Also," Priya said, "I'm going to need a raise." Oleg's eyes went wide. Nikolai blinked, and then he laughed. Not the not-quite smile, brief and genuine, that transformed his entirely. "Yes," he said. "You are." The Hargrove situation resolved itself over the following 2 weeks in ways that Priya was not fully briefed on and did not ask about. Hargrove stopped coming to the office. A set of financial documents that had been causing significant stress appeared to be significantly less stressful. Nikolai came in one morning looking like a man who had just closed a long chapter, and Priya had his coffee on his desk before he'd taken his coat off. He stopped in the doorway. "How did you know I needed this right now?" he said, which was not quite a question. "You have a look," she said, "when something's finished. You hold your shoulders differently." He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "How long have you been paying attention to how I hold my shoulders?" "Since approximately day 4, Priya said, and went back to her desk, and did not look up to see his expression, because she had some operational self-preservation instinct left. It was Constance who told her, on a Thursday morning 6 weeks in, that she had broken every record the office had. The previous longest was 9 days, Constance said. "Felix told me," Priya said. "The one before that was 6. They left because of the stress." Constance tilted her head slightly. Some of them were not suited to the environment. Some of them were frightened. One was simply not very good. She paused. "You are good, and you are not frightened, and you somehow managed to remain standing despite." She gestured with remarkable eloquence at the coffee machine Priya had replaced last week. "I've always been better at people than at objects," Priya said. "Yes," Constance said. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" The night she finally definitively understood how Nikolai Dragan felt about her was a Thursday. She had been working late again, and he had been working late, and it was past 9 when she knocked on his open door to say she was heading out. He looked up from his desk, and for a moment just looked at her, and she registered, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that the way he looked at her was not the way someone looks at an administrative assistant. "The Pellegrini account brief," she said. "I left it on the desk. It's flagged, the section on the harbor contracts. There's a conflict with the Moreau paperwork from—" "Priya," he said. She stopped. "Come in," he said, and closed the door. She came in. She closed the door. She stood in the middle of his office, which she had reorganized on her second week, because his filing system was an act of aggression against organizational logic, and she waited. He stood up from behind his desk. He was taller than her. She'd always been aware of this in a peripheral way, and he crossed the room until he was a reasonable distance away and stopped. "I have been in this industry for 18 years, he said, "and I have never had an assistant who lasted 2 months. "I know," she said. "I have also never had an assistant who talked back to Oleg, threatened a man in my parking garage, broke the same printer twice, and told me I needed a raise before I offered it. To be fair, the second printer incident was the power surge, not Priya. Yes, I'm trying to tell you something." She went quiet. "You walked into my restaurant and ruined 4 suits, he said, "and I kept requesting your section every week because it was the first time in longer than I can remember that I looked forward to something." He paused. "That's not a normal thing for me to say." "I know," she said. "I'm aware that I am not a simple person to be around, that the life I have is not." "I'm aware," Priya said. "I'm not finished. Sorry, go ahead." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm asking," he said, "whether you want to have dinner with me. Not at Palazzo, where you will inevitably destroy something. Somewhere else." She looked at him. He looked back. The grey eyes were doing the unreadable thing, but underneath it for the first time, she could actually read something. Not certainty, something more like hope, which looked foreign on a face like his, which made it more real somehow. "You should know," she said, "that I am not going to be less clumsy. I'm not going to become a different person. I'm going to keep breaking things and talking back to Oleg. And I'm aware," he said, "of exactly who you are." "Okay," she said. "Okay? Yes," she said, "dinner. But I choose the restaurant." He raised an eyebrow. "Somewhere with no white tablecloths," she said, "and no glasses that cost more than my rent, because I will feel terrible if I break them, and I will break them." This time the laugh came fully, warm and unguarded, and he looked about 10 years younger for the duration of it. And Priya Nair stood in the office she had reorganized and thought, "Oh no, And then, immediately after, "Oh, okay, this is fine. This is actually fine. I know a place," he said, "that uses paper cups. Perfect," she said. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. And because she was Priya, and this was how her life worked, she caught the strap on the door handle on the way out, and her entire bag upended onto the floor, spilling her wallet and 3 pens and an emergency granola bar and her very battered copy of a hospitality management textbook she still carried everywhere. She looked at it. She looked back at him. He was crouched down already, picking up the pens. He handed them back to her, one at a time, and the last thing he handed her was the textbook, and he turned it over and looked at the cover, worn, annotated, clearly read many times, and then looked at her, and the expression on his face was not the measured, unreadable thing she'd gotten used to. It was simple. It was uncomplicated. It was the look of a man who had decided something and was not going to undecide it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank whatever force of nature made you trip at table 4. She laughed, which surprised her, genuinely surprised her, the way the best things usually do, and walked out into the hallway and thought that the universe, which had spent her entire life conspiring against her ankles, her trays, her printers, and her general relationship with gravity, might finally be doing something useful with all of it.